The first time the words settled into his chest, they felt heavier than any winter coat he had ever worn. Heavier than the silence that followed his mother's funeral. Heavier than the years he had spent convincing himself that being alone was a choice and not a wound. It happened on a quiet afternoon when the sun leaned low over the fields, when life seemed simple from a distance but unbearably complex up close. Those words did not arrive as a demand or a plea, but as a fragile truth whispered into a moment neither of them would ever forget, and from that instant, everything that had been broken began to tremble with the possibility of becoming whole again. Before the story unfolds any further, pause for a moment and ask yourself whether you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in love that grows from unexpected soil. If you do, take a second to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so stories like this can keep reaching hearts that are quietly waiting to heal. His name was Matthew Carter, and he lived on the edge of a small farming town in Iowa, where the land stretched wide and honest, and people learned early how to carry both pride and pain without complaint. Matthew was 34 and had the tired eyes of someone who had learned responsibility too young. After his mother passed away from a long illness, his father, Robert Carter, grew stern in a quiet, disappointed way, not cruel but burdened by fear. Robert believed a man needed an anchor, a partner to steady him, someone who could keep the house warm when the nights grew long. Matthew heard that belief often, woven into advice that sounded practical but felt like judgment. He worked the land, repaired fences, woke before dawn, and returned home each evening to a house that echoed his footsteps back at him, like a reminder that something was missing. Grace Whitmore arrived in town the way storms sometimes do, quietly, almost unnoticed at first, yet carrying the promise of change. She was 29, with kind eyes shaped by loss and resilience, and she had come from Missouri after leaving a life that never quite fit her. Grace had grown up in a family that believed faith was proven through endurance, even when endurance meant staying in places that hurt. When she finally left an emotionally draining relationship and a job that hollowed her spirit, she followed a distant aunt's suggestion and applied for work at a local dairy farm near Matthew's land. She told herself it was temporary, just a pause to breathe, but something in the open skies made her feel seen again. Matthew noticed Grace long before he understood why. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, a softness that did not beg for attention but commanded respect. They spoke in passing at first, exchanging polite nods, then longer conversations about work, weather, and the strange comfort of routine. Grace listened in a way that made Matthew feel heard without being exposed, and Matthew offered help without expecting gratitude. Over time, their shared silences became as meaningful as their words, and the land around them seemed to notice, blooming brighter, holding their footsteps longer. Yet life does not allow peace to exist without challenge. Robert's health began to decline, and his concerns grew sharper. He worried about Matthew's future, about legacy, about loneliness. He spoke of marriage not as romance but as survival, as though love were a tool instead of a miracle. Matthew felt torn between honoring his father's wishes and protecting the fragile connection growing in his own heart. He did not see himself as worthy of asking anyone to share his burdens, least of all Grace, who had already carried so much of her own. Grace, too, wrestled with fear. She had learned how easily love could become obligation, how quickly care could turn into sacrifice without joy. She watched Matthew from a careful distance, sensing his kindness, but unsure if it was safe to trust again. She prayed in quiet moments, asking for clarity, for courage, for a sign that this place, this connection, was not another temporary shelter she would have to abandon. The turning point came on an ordinary evening that felt extraordinary simply because of its honesty. Grace had spent the day helping Robert with small tasks, listening to his stories of youth and regret, of dreams he never spoke aloud. She saw the love he carried for his son, tangled in fear and expectation. When she returned to Matthew's side later that day, something in her expression had softened, deepened, as if she had stepped into a truth she could no longer ignore. She shared what Robert believed, not as pressure, but as concern. And in that vulnerable moment, Grace revealed her own longing to belong somewhere without losing herself. Matthew felt the world narrow to the space between them. Years of restraint, of self-denial loosened their grip. He realized that love was not something to be earned after becoming perfect, but something that helped imperfect people grow. He understood that inviting someone to stay was not a demand, but a gift offered freely. In his heart, he chose courage over fear, presence over distance, and hope over habit. From that day forward, change did not arrive all at once, but it came steadily. Matthew and Grace began building a life not defined by expectations, but by shared values. They worked side by side, prayed together on quiet mornings, and learned how to disagree without withdrawing. Robert watched from the porch as laughter returned to the house, as meals felt warmer, as his son stood taller, not because he was obeying, but because he was alive in a way he had not been before. Robert's own heart softened, and with time he let go of control, trusting God to guide what he could no longer manage. Grace found healing in small victories, in the way Matthew respected her boundaries, in the way he asked rather than assumed, in the way he stayed when things felt difficult instead of walking away. She learned that love did not have to hurt to be real, and that faith could feel like peace instead of endurance. Together, they faced doubts, financial struggles, and the lingering shadows of past mistakes, but they did so with hands joined and eyes forward. As seasons passed, the land around them reflected their growth. Fields once neglected flourished, fences stood strong, and the house that once echoed with loneliness filled with shared purpose. Neighbors noticed the change, not because it was loud, but because it was genuine. Matthew became known not just as a hard-working farmer, but as a man who had learned how to love with humility. Grace became a quiet pillar in the community, offering kindness without condition, listening without judgment. If this story is touching something deep within you, if it reminds you of a time you longed for belonging or found courage when you least expected it, please take a moment now to like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe so more stories like this can continue to spread hope. Just before the end, we have one special request for you. Please comment below with a single word that describes how this story made you feel, because your words help this channel reach hearts that are still searching. In the end, Matthew understood that love did not arrive as a command or a solution, but as an invitation to stay, to build, to believe. Grace understood that belonging was not about being needed, but about being chosen freely. And in a quiet town under a wide American sky, two wounded hearts found redemption not through perfection, but through presence, faith, and the courage to whisper truth into a moment that changed everything forever.